The day I found out my own parents were trying to seize every single asset I owned, a cold dread coiled in my gut. It wasn't just about the money, though that was a considerable sum. It was the ultimate betrayal, a knife twisted deep by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and for years, I built a life of quiet success in the heart of Vermont, a life I thought was secure, a life I thought my family respected. I had worked tirelessly, invested wisely, and believed in the American dream of generational wealth. Then, a single, unassuming letter from their lawyer landed on my doorstep, shattering that illusion into a million pieces. I remember standing in my living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The words on the page blurred, then snapped into sickening focus. A legal petition, bold and unapologetic, claiming I was unfit to manage my own affairs, seeking guardianship over my finances, over my entire existence. Unfit? I had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal, secured my company's future, and was planning my first real vacation in years. The resentment ignited instantly, a fiery inferno in my chest. How could they? How could the people who taught me about hard work and integrity turn around and try to steal everything I had built? The initial shock quickly morphed into a burning obsession. I wasn't just angry, I was consumed. Every waking moment became a strategic session, every conversation a potential clue. I replayed every holiday dinner, every strained phone call, searching for the moment the foundation of our family fractured. Was it my refusal to bail out their failing business 5 years ago? Was it my decision to move out of state for college, choosing ambition over proximity? The betrayal wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, insidious poison, seeping into the very fabric of our relationship, until it reached this toxic climax. I hired the best legal team money could buy, a formidable group of litigators from Boston known for their ruthless efficiency. They looked at my parents' petition and scoffed, but I saw the danger, the calculated malice behind it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hostile takeover, a blatant attempt to strip me bare. I dove into financial records, old emails, even childhood photographs, looking for anything that could explain this level of avarice, this profound lack of love. What I uncovered wasn't just a simple desire for money. It was a web of deceit, a long-game strategy that made my stomach churn. They believed I was too trusting, too naive, too busy building my empire to notice the subtle shifts in their behavior, the increasingly pointed questions about my investments, the thinly veiled envy in their voices. They saw my success not as a source of pride, but as a resource to be plundered. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that I had been preparing for a moment like this my entire life. Not for them specifically, but for any challenge too. My autonomy, any threat to the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, a crisp autumn morning that felt anything but peaceful. I walked into the courtroom, the air thick with tension, my legal team flanking me like guardians. Across the aisle sat my parents, their faces a mask of feigned concern, their eyes glinting with an unsettling blend of entitlement and expectation. They exchanged pleasantries with their lawyer, confident, assured. They believed they had me cornered, that their carefully constructed narrative of my supposed incompetence would prevail. They called their first witness, a distant relative I barely knew, who painted a picture of me as reckless and irresponsible, prone to risky ventures. I watched, stone-faced, as the lies piled up, each one a fresh sting. But beneath my calm exterior, a plan was unfolding, a meticulously crafted counter-narrative designed to expose their true intentions. My parents smirked, believing they had already won. They had no idea what I had been preparing, the devastating evidence I had meticulously gathered, the crushing truth that was about to be unleashed. The judge cleared his throat, and the courtroom fell silent. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a reckoning. And they were about to discover exactly what happens when you underestimate the child you thought you controlled. My name is Alex, For years, I believed my life was a carefully constructed masterpiece, a testament to hard work and unwavering dedication. Every brick, every beam, every window of my burgeoning real estate empire in Los Angeles, I'd laid with my own hands, figuratively speaking. I'd started from nothing, a kid with big dreams and an even bigger loan from a local credit union, and transformed a dilapidated corner lot into a thriving commercial hub. It wasn't just about the money, it was about proving something, to myself and to the world. But mostly, it was about proving something to my parents, Richard and Eleanor. They'd always seen me as the black sheep, the one who colored outside the lines, the dreamer who needed to get a real job. Their constant criticism, their thinly veiled disapproval, had been a persistent hum in the background of my life. I'd spent decades trying to earn their respect, to show them that my unconventional path was not only viable, but wildly successful. And for a while it seemed I had. My company, Alex's Ascendant Properties, was a name whispered with respect in boardrooms across California. I owned properties from Santa Monica to Malibu, each one a jewel in my carefully curated crown. My net worth, a figure that would make most people's eyes water, was a direct result of my relentless drive. Then came the phone call, an innocuous ring that shattered my world into a million jagged pieces. It was Eleanor. Her voice laced with a sweetness I hadn't heard since I was a child, a sweetness that now, in retrospect, tasted like poison. She told me Richard had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer. My heart seized. Despite our fractured relationship, they were still my parents. I dropped everything, flying back to our sprawling family estate in the Hollywood Hills, a place I'd avoided for years. The house itself was a monument to their old money, old-world sensibilities. Ornate, imposing, and filled with a silence that always felt heavy, it was the antithesis of the modern, vibrant spaces I created. Richard, usually a man of formidable presence, was a shadow of his former self, his eyes sunken, his skin pale. Eleanor, ever the stoic, moved through the house with a practiced grace, her face a mask of concern. I tried to offer comfort, to bridge the chasm that had grown between us, but every attempt felt like walking on eggshells. Their responses were clipped, their gazes distant. It was as if they were already grieving, not just for Richard's health, but for something else entirely. Days turned into weeks. I put my life on hold, my company running on autopilot, as I tried to be the dutiful son they'd always wanted. I arranged for the best doctors, the most cutting-edge treatments, sparing no expense. After all, I had the means. My financial advisor, Sarah, called me daily, worried about the significant withdrawals I was making from my personal accounts. I assured her it was all for Richard's care, a necessary expense. I even started to believe that perhaps this tragedy could be a catalyst for reconciliation. A chance to finally heal old wounds. I was so incredibly naive. One afternoon, I found a stack of legal documents on Richard's bedside table, carelessly left open. My eyes scanned the bold headings, and a cold dread began to creep into my stomach. They were estate planning documents, specifically a series of transfers and trusts. But what truly froze me was the name of the beneficiary listed on multiple accounts I recognized as belonging to me, the Richard and Eleanor Hawthorne Family Trust. My heart pounded against my ribs. This couldn't be right. I was Alex Hawthorne, their only child. Why would my assets be listed as belonging to a family trust, and why had I never seen these documents before? I confronted Eleanor, my voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. She met my gaze with an unsettling calm, her eyes like chips of ice. "Alex, your father and I have been discussing this for some time," she began, her tone devoid of any warmth. "Given your unconventional business practices, we felt it was necessary to ensure the family's legacy was protected. You tend to be rather impulsive." Impulsive? I had built an empire from scratch. My impulsiveness was calculated risk-taking, a trait that had made me millions. The truth, a bitter pill, began to form in my mind. They weren't protecting their legacy, They were trying to seize mine. They saw my success not as a triumph, but as a resource to be controlled, a fortune to be absorbed into their own. The resentment I'd harbored for years, the subtle digs and constant criticisms, suddenly coalesced into a sharp, burning anger. They didn't want my love or my presence, they wanted my money. And they were using Richard's illness as a smokescreen. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls to Sarah, to my lawyers, to anyone who could shed light on this betrayal. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was clear. Through a series of cleverly orchestrated maneuvers, some dating back years, Richard and Eleanor had been quietly moving to gain control of a significant portion of my assets. They had exploited a loophole, a clause in a decades-old family agreement I'd barely glanced at, an agreement I'd signed when I was too young and too trusting to understand its implications. They claimed I was financially reckless, incapable of managing my own wealth, a charge that was not only false, but deeply insulting. I felt a profound sense of violation, a betrayal so deep it cut to my very soul. This wasn't just about money, it was about their complete disregard for my autonomy, my hard work, my very identity. They weren't just taking my assets, they were trying to take away my life's work, my independence, everything I had fought so hard to build. The resentment I felt transformed into something far more potent, a cold, calculated fury. They had underestimated me, Alex Hawthorne. They had mistaken my desire for reconciliation for weakness. They were about to learn that the black sheep had teeth, and I was prepared to bite back with everything I had. This was no longer about proving myself, it was about fighting for my very existence, and they had no idea what I had already prepared. The scent of antique wood polish and fading potpourri still clung to the air, a familiar, suffocating perfume that had defined my childhood. I walked through the grand, silent halls of their estate, a ghost in my own past. Every ornate frame, every polished surface, whispered tales of expectation and disappointment. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, had cultivated an image of impeccable grace, but beneath the veneer, a colder calculation always hummed. Now, with Richard's supposed illness as their latest weapon, that calculation had reached a terrifying crescendo. My initial shock had quickly curdled into a bitter understanding. That saccharine sweetness in Eleanor's voice, the sudden urgency in Richard's strained calls. It wasn't love or concern. It was allure. My mind replayed every interaction since my arrival, every overly solicitous gesture, every pointed question about my assets, my investments, the sheer scale of Alex's ascendant properties. They weren't asking as concerned parents, they were probing, assessing the spoils. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing my breath and leaving a metallic taste of betrayal in my mouth. They weren't seeking comfort or reconciliation. They were circling, like vultures around a dying animal, ready to pick me clean. The next few days unfolded in a blur of forced pleasantries and veiled aggressions. Eleanor, ever the master manipulator, orchestrated tearful confessions from Richard about his declining health, his fear for their future, and the desperate need to secure their legacy. Each performance was designed to tug at my heartstrings, to exploit the lingering hope within me for a genuine connection. But the hope was dying, replaced by a searing anger. I saw through their charade, the thinly veiled avarice in their eyes whenever my name or my company's success was mentioned. They spoke of family unity and protecting what was ours, but their gaze always drifted to the sprawling financial statements I'd foolishly brought with me, a testament to my hard-won empire. One evening, after a particularly draining dinner where Richard dramatically coughed his way through a discussion about my offshore accounts, I retreated to my old bedroom. The room, preserved like a museum exhibit, offered no comfort. It felt like a cage. I paced, the rage building inside me, a hot, insistent pressure behind my eyes. They wanted my life's work. They wanted to dismantle the very identity I had painstakingly built, all under the guise of familial love and a fabricated illness. The audacity, the sheer, unadulterated gall of it, was breathtaking. I remembered a conversation from years ago, a casual remark from Richard over Sunday brunch. He'd scoffed at my early ventures, dismissing them as childish fantasies, then added, "You'll never truly amount to anything, Alex, not without a proper foundation." The implication was clear. I was nothing without their name, their lineage, their approval. Now, they sought to claim the very foundation I had built for myself, piece by painful piece. The irony was a bitter pill. My phone buzzed, a text from my lawyer, a sharp, astute woman named Sarah. Her message was brief: "We need to talk." Urgent. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew what this meant. The initial legal maneuvers, the veiled threats they had hinted at, were now in motion. They were going to try to seize my assets, claiming incompetence, undue influence, anything to get their grasping hands on my fortune. They, my own parents, were launching a full-scale legal assault. A cold dread seeped into my bones, quickly followed by an even colder resolve. They thought they had me cornered, vulnerable, heartbroken. They believed my emotional ties would blind me to their machinations. But they were wrong. The years of their subtle cruelty, their constant undermining, had forged something unbreakable within me. I was no longer the child desperate for their approval. I was a formidable force, honed by the very ambition they had always scorned. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my determined face. My fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing encrypted files, reviewing legal documents, cross-referencing financial records. For months, ever since a fleeting comment from a family friend had sparked a flicker of suspicion, I had been preparing. I had anticipated this betrayal, this brazen attempt to strip me of everything. Every contingency had been considered, every vulnerability shored up, every countermove meticulously planned. They wanted a war? They were about to get one. The resentment that had simmered for decades now boiled over, transforming into a potent, focused obsession. I would not let them win. I would not let them dismantle my life's work. The game had changed. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my dignity, my very self. They had mistaken my desire for reconciliation for weakness. They had no idea the extent of my preparations, the intricate web I had woven, waiting for this precise moment. The black sheep was about to reveal a wolf's cunning, and they were about to face the consequences of their greed. The initial shock of Richard's supposed illness quickly gave way to a cold, hard suspicion. The sweetness in Eleanor's voice, the sudden urgency, it all felt off. My parents had never been ones for open displays of affection, especially not towards me. Their love had always been conditional, tied to achievements and appearances. This newfound concern, this theatrical plea for my return, felt like a meticulously crafted performance. I remembered the conversation with Eleanor, the way her voice had wavered just a little too perfectly when she mentioned Richard's diagnosis, almost as if she were reading from a script. The unease gnawed at me, a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. My first move was to discreetly reach out to Dr. Ramirez, the family physician for decades. I fabricated a story about needing to update my own medical records, hoping to glean some information without raising any alarms. Dr. Ramirez, a man whose loyalty to my parents was legendary, was tight-lipped, his responses vague and evasive. He spoke in generalities about patient confidentiality, his eyes flickering away from mine a little too often. His evasiveness, rather than reassuring me, only solidified my growing suspicion. Something was definitely amiss. I then turned to my network, a web of contacts I had cultivated over years of navigating the cutthroat world of Los Angeles real estate. One of my most trusted associates, a former private investigator named Marcus, now ran a high-end security firm. He was a man who understood discretion and had a knack for uncovering inconvenient truths. I met him in a secluded booth at a dimly lit bar in Santa Monica, the kind of place where secrets were exchanged over clinking ice and hushed whispers. I laid out my concerns, the odd phone call, Dr. Ramirez's evasiveness, the sudden shift in my parents' demeanor. Marcus listened intently, his gaze unwavering, occasionally nodding as I spoke. "It sounds like a classic setup, Alex," he finally said, his voice low. "The ailing parent card is an old one, but still effective, especially when there's significant wealth involved." He agreed to look into it, starting with Richard's medical records. Within days, the truth began to unravel, slowly at first, then with a sickening speed. Marcus's initial reports confirmed my worst fears. There was no aggressive cancer. There was no rare disease. Richard's medical history showed nothing more than routine checkups and a slightly elevated cholesterol level, typical for a man his age. The diagnosis was a complete fabrication, a cruel and calculated lie. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, a cold wave washing over me. They had used illness, a universal fear, to manipulate me. The depth of their deception was staggering, but the revelations didn't stop there. Marcus's investigation unearthed a series of alarming financial transactions. Large sums of money, millions of dollars, had been systematically siphoned from various shell corporations tied to my parents' assets. These transactions were complex, designed to obscure the true beneficiaries, but Marcus was a master at following the money trail. He traced the funds to offshore accounts, then to a series of seemingly legitimate businesses, all ultimately controlled by a shadowy consortium. Then came the bombshell. My parents had been embroiled in a series of disastrous investments, a desperate attempt to shore up their dwindling fortune. They had poured money into speculative ventures, all of which had failed spectacularly. The family estate, the one I had returned to, the monument to their old money, was mortgaged to the hilt. They were on the brink of financial ruin, their carefully constructed facade of wealth crumbling around them. The full picture emerged with brutal clarity. They hadn't called me out of concern or a desire for reconciliation. They had called me because I was their last resort, their golden goose. They intended to use Richard's fabricated illness as leverage, to guilt-trip me into bailing them out, or worse, to somehow seize control of my assets. The sweetness in Eleanor's voice, the concern, it was all a performance designed to lure me into their trap. A cold rage settled deep within me. It wasn't just the money, it was the sheer audacity, the callous disregard for my emotions, the willingness to exploit my lingering hope for a genuine connection. My parents, the people who were supposed to love and protect me, had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to financially ruin me. The black sheep was no longer just an outsider, I was a target. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. My initial anger, sharp and blinding, slowly morphed into a chilling resolve. The game had indeed changed. This wasn't about resentment anymore. It was about survival, about protecting everything I had built. They had underestimated me for decades, dismissing my drive, my intelligence, my ability to not just survive but thrive in a world they deemed beneath them. They saw me as an endless wellspring of wealth, a resource to be exploited. But I was not a resource. I was a force. And they were about to discover the true cost of their deception. The pieces of my counter-strategy, meticulously planned over years of anticipating their eventual betrayal, began to click into place. The intricate web I had woven was not just for defense, it was for offense. Every seemingly innocuous decision I had made, every seemingly random investment, every partnership forged, was now revealing its true purpose. The emotional arc was no longer just resentment, it had deepened into an obsession, a burning need for justice. Not just legal justice, but a reckoning, a profound rebalancing of the scales. They had sought to strip me bare, to leave me with nothing. But I had prepared for this moment, for the day their true colors would finally be revealed. And when that day came, I would be ready. The wolf was no longer hiding in the shadows, it was ready to hunt. The trap was set, meticulously crafted over weeks of sleepless nights and relentless planning. My once pristine office, a sanctuary of order, had transformed into a war room, littered with legal documents, financial projections, and strategic flowcharts. Every move they had ever made, every shady deal, every whispered secret I had unearthed. It wasn't just about winning, it was about dismantling their carefully constructed facade piece by piece, exposing the rot beneath. My legal team, a formidable collection of sharks I'd hand-picked for their ruthlessness and discretion, worked in shifts, fueled by coffee and the promise of a monumental victory. They understood the stakes, not just for me, but for the principle of the thing. This wasn't a corporate takeover, it was a crusade. I remembered the day the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. It was a seemingly innocuous email, buried deep within a server I'd managed to access through unconventional means. An old correspondent of Richard's, complaining about a land deal gone sour years ago, mentioning a shell corporation and a substantial payoff. The name of the shell corporation, a bland, forgettable string of letters and numbers, ignited a spark in my mind. It was the same entity that had mysteriously acquired a significant portion of my company's shares years prior, shares I had been told were held by a reputable investment firm. The deception was breathtaking in its audacity. That discovery was the thread I pulled, unraveling a tapestry of deceit that stretched back decades. Richard and Eleanor hadn't just tried to seize my assets recently, they had been systematically siphoning off my wealth, manipulating my company from the shadows, ever since I'd started building it. The investment firm was a front. The business advice they'd given me over the years, carefully steering me towards certain ventures and away from others, was designed to maximize their hidden profits, while keeping me just successful enough to remain a lucrative target. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a cold, hard knot of betrayal tightening in my chest. All those years I'd spent trying to prove myself, trying to earn their love, I had merely been a pawn in their elaborate self-serving game. My obsession deepened, shifting from a quest for justice to an unyielding demand for retribution. The cancer diagnosis, the supposed reason for their sudden, saccharine kindness, now felt like a cruel joke, another layer of their manipulative genius. They had played me for a fool, banking on my filial loyalty to blind me to their true intentions. But my eyes were wide open now, and I saw them for what they truly were, predators in tailored suits, wolves in sheep's clothing. The next step was critical: the public exposure. I couldn't just win in a courtroom. I needed the world to see their true faces. I leaked carefully curated documents to an investigative journalist I trusted implicitly, a woman known for her tenacity and her unwavering commitment to truth. The story, when it broke, would be an earthquake, shaking the foundations of their carefully constructed reputation. It wasn't about vengeance in the dark, it was about shining a spotlight on their hypocrisy, letting the world judge them. The day the article was scheduled to run, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the calm of a general before battle, knowing every contingency had been considered, every weakness exploited. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Eleanor, her voice strained, a frantic edge replacing the feigned sweetness. She had heard whispers, she said, about an impending exposé. She pleaded with me, her words tumbling out in a desperate torrent, begging me to reconsider, to protect the family name. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. They had never cared about the family name when they were systematically dismantling mine. I listened in silence, letting her words wash over me, devoid of any genuine emotion. The years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the insidious manipulations, all coalesced into a single unbreakable resolve. There was no turning back, no room for mercy. This wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming my identity, my worth, the very essence of who I was. This was about proving that even the most cunning predators could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately, brought to their knees. The wolf had found its prey, and the hunt was far from over. It was time for the world to witness the unraveling of Richard and Eleanor. The day of the hearing arrived, cloaked in a chilling Los Angeles fog that mirrored the turmoil in my gut. I walked into the courtroom, the marble floors gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the shadowy corners of my parents' machinations. Richard and Eleanor were already there, seated at their table, their faces a carefully constructed mask of dignified sorrow. Eleanor wore a tasteful black suit, her pearl necklace gleaming, a symbol of the old money she clung to so desperately. Richard, gaunt and pale, leaned heavily on a cane, playing the part of the ailing patriarch to perfection. A wave of bitter resentment washed over me, a familiar tide that had been building for weeks. They caught my eye, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of triumph in Eleanor's gaze. A smug satisfaction that she believed her plan was foolproof. They had underestimated me. Profoundly. My legal team, a meticulously assembled collection of sharks I'd hired from the top firms in the city, stood ready. We had spent countless hours preparing, dissecting every detail of their fraudulent claims, every forged document, every coerced statement. The courtroom was packed, a morbid curiosity drawing reporters and socialites alike. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was a spectacle. The judge, a stern woman with an air of weary authority, called the proceedings to order. Richard's lawyer began, painting a picture of a devoted son, me, who had callously abandoned his dying father, refusing to contribute to his exorbitant medical bills. He presented the fabricated documents, the doctored bank statements, all designed to show my alleged financial negligence. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, even though I had anticipated it. They had truly gone for the jugular. Eleanor, when she took the stand, delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar. Her voice trembled as she spoke of Richard's declining health, her own heartbreak, and the immense burden placed upon them. She even shed a few strategically placed tears, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. The courtroom, for a moment, seemed to sway in her favor. Then it was my turn. My lawyer, a woman with eyes like steel and a voice that commanded attention, began her cross-examination. She started gently, questioning Eleanor about the specifics of Richard's diagnosis, the hospitals, the treatments. Eleanor, confident in her lies, answered smoothly, her narrative rehearsed to perfection. But then, my lawyer pivoted, her voice sharpening. "Mrs. Vance," she began, "you testified that your husband's illness was sudden and aggressive, correct?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice still laced with feigned sorrow. "And that it necessitated immediate and costly medical intervention?" "Absolutely. Yet, we have here Mrs. Vance," my lawyer stated, holding up a thick file, a detailed medical report from the Mayo Clinic, dated 6 months prior to your husband's alleged diagnosis, indicating a clean bill of health. Furthermore, we have sworn affidavits from 3 separate oncologists, all confirming that Mr. Vance has no history of the rare cancer you described. In fact, Mr. Vance's current medical records show him to be in remarkably good health for a man his age. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's composure shattered. Her face, usually so composed, contorted into a mask of pure shock and fury. Richard, who had been leaning back, suddenly sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with dawning horror. They had been so certain, so arrogant in their deception. My lawyer continued, her voice unwavering. "And these bank statements, Mrs. Vance, which purport to show Mr. Alex Vance's refusal to contribute to medical expenses. We have forensic accounting reports here that demonstrate these statements were digitally altered. The original transactions, in fact, show significant regular contributions from Mr. Alex Vance to a trust fund specifically established for your husband's long-term care, a trust fund which, ironically, you and Mr. Vance liquidated entirely 3 weeks ago." The air in the courtroom crackled with tension. The judge's expression hardened, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. The whispers grew louder, turning into an undeniable buzz. The trap had been sprung. I watched as Eleanor's carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Her eyes darted to Richard, a silent, desperate plea for him to salvage their collapsing narrative. But Richard, for the first time in his life, looked utterly defeated. The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. The image of him, so powerful and intimidating for so long, now reduced to this pathetic state, brought a strange, bitter satisfaction. My lawyer wasn't finished. She presented evidence of their extensive offshore accounts they had meticulously hidden for years, accounts that dwarfed my supposed contributions. She revealed their lavish spending sprees, their recent acquisition of a sprawling villa in Tuscany, all while claiming financial destitution. The sheer audacity of their scheme, laid bare for the world to see, was staggering. The obsession that had consumed me, the relentless pursuit of justice, was finally reaching its crescendo. The judge called for a recess, her voice sharp, her patience clearly at an end. As Eleanor was led away, her face a picture of utter devastation, she met my gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes now, only a raw, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a predator caught in its own snare. Richard, unable to meet anyone's eyes, simply stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The silence that followed their departure was deafening, broken only by the frantic scribbling of reporters. The truth, ugly and undeniable, had finally emerged. The world would now witness the unraveling of Richard and Eleanor, not as a tragedy, but as a consequence of their own greed and deceit. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and public spectacle. My team, the same brilliant minds who had helped me build my empire, now meticulously dismantled my parents' carefully constructed facade. Every hidden asset, every offshore account, every shady deal was brought into the unforgiving light. The media, a ravenous beast, fed voraciously on every revelation, painting a portrait of Richard and Eleanor that was far removed from the philanthropic, upstanding citizens they had so meticulously pretended to be. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a strange sense of detachment settling over me. The fury that had fueled me for so long had begun to recede, replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic satisfaction. I remember the day the final judgment came down. It wasn't a courtroom drama, Richard and Eleanor, facing insurmountable evidence and the crushing weight of public opinion, had settled. The terms were brutal. A complete divestment of their ill-gotten gains, including the sprawling estate in the Hollywood Hills, the very house I had grown up in, the one that had always felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Their entire fortune, meticulously built on a foundation of deceit, was to be liquidated, much of it directed towards the charities they had once so publicly championed, a final, ironic twist. Richard and Eleanor were left with virtually nothing, their reputations irrevocably shattered, their social standing reduced to rubble. A few weeks later, I stood on the manicured lawns of the estate, the setting sun casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. The house, once a symbol of their power, now stood empty, echoing with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken words. I had bought it back, not out of any sentimental attachment, but as a final, definitive statement. It was mine now. A tangible representation of everything they had tried to take from me, and everything they had lost. The air was cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the palm trees. I wasn't there to gloat, or even to celebrate. A profound weariness had settled in my bones, the kind that comes after a long, arduous war. My phone rang. It was Eleanor. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. For a moment, the old anger flickered, a residual ember in the dying fire. But then, a different emotion surfaced, a strange, almost pitying empathy. I answered. Her voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its former imperiousness. She spoke of regret, of mistakes, of how they had always wanted the best for me, even if they had gone about it in the wrong way. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their lives. I listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. I didn't interrupt, didn't accuse. I just let her speak, letting the words wash over me like a distant, harmless tide. When she finished, there was a long silence. I looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, a sprawling tapestry of dreams and desires. "Eleanor," I finally said, my voice calm, devoid of any discernible emotion, "you and Richard made your choices. And I made mine." There was no anger in my tone, no triumph, just a simple statement of fact. I could hear her quiet sob on the other end, a sound that, years ago, would have torn at my heart. Now, it stirred nothing more than a faint echo of what once was. I wished them well, a hollow courtesy, and ended the call. That night, I walked through the empty rooms of the house. The grand ballroom, where they had hosted countless lavish parties, now felt cavernous and cold. The study, where Richard had once held court, felt small and insignificant. Every corner held a memory, a whisper of a childhood I had spent trying to earn their love, their approval. I realized then that my victory wasn't about the money, or the properties, or even their public humiliation. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, about finally severing the toxic ties that had bound me to their expectations. The weight lifted from my shoulders, a tangible sensation of release. The obsession that had consumed me, the burning need for justice, had finally run its course. I hadn't destroyed them out of hatred. Not entirely. I had done it to save myself, to finally be free. My parents had tried to seize everything, but in their greed, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift, the absolute certainty of my own strength, my own resilience. The world I had built, brick by brick, was truly mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, unequivocally, at peace. The closure wasn't sweet, not exactly. It was a stark, almost brutal kind of peace, born from the ashes of a painful past. But it was mine, and it was enough. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, a sound that should have brought me a sense of triumph, but instead it felt hollow. "Case dismissed," the judge declared, his voice cutting through the thick silence. My parents, their faces a mask of disbelief and fury, stared at me as if I were a stranger, an enemy they had never known. Their lawyers, once so confident, now shuffled their papers, avoiding eye contact. The elaborate web they'd spun, designed to strip me of everything I'd built, had unraveled spectacularly. The meticulous documentation, the ironclad contracts, the video evidence of their coercion and manipulation, it had all been too much for their fabricated narrative to withstand. As I walked out of that courthouse, the bright afternoon sun felt almost blinding. I was free. Free from their control, free from their endless demands, free from the suffocating weight of their expectations. But the freedom didn't taste as sweet as I'd imagined. The victory, though absolute, was steeped in a profound sadness. I had won, yes, but at what cost? I had lost the family I thought I had, the illusion of love and support I had clung to for so long. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They truly never saw me, only what they could extract from me. Days turned into weeks, and the initial adrenaline of the courtroom faded, replaced by a quiet ache. I found myself staring at the sprawling vineyard, the very asset they had so desperately tried to seize. It was my sanctuary, my life's work, and now it felt tainted by their greed. I walked through the rows of grapevines, touching the leaves, feeling the earth beneath my feet. This place had been my escape, my dream, a testament to my resilience. It was here, among these vines, that I had poured my heart and soul, building something beautiful and lasting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I sat on the porch of my farmhouse. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rich soil and blooming jasmine. I held a glass of my own vintage, a wine born from years of dedication and struggle. As I savored its complex notes, a different kind of understanding began to bloom within me. Their actions, their relentless pursuit of my assets, had forced me to confront a fundamental truth. My worth was not tied to their approval, nor was my happiness dependent on their presence. The true victory wasn't in winning the lawsuit, but in reclaiming myself. It was in the quiet strength I found, the unwavering belief in my own abilities, and the profound realization that I was enough, just as I was. I had spent so much of my life seeking their validation, trying to earn a love that was never freely given. Now, I understood that their love was conditional, a transaction, and I was no longer willing to pay the price. I raised my glass, not to vengeance, but to renewal. To the difficult lessons learned, to the painful truths uncovered, and to the unwavering spirit that had carried me through the darkest of times. The bitterness still lingered, a scar on my heart, but beneath it, a new resilience had taken root. I looked out at the vineyard, bathed in the soft twilight. It was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of my rebirth, a testament to my unwavering spirit. The battle was over. The war within me had finally found its peace, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, unequivocally free. The closure I sought wasn't in their defeat, but in my own liberation.